The snow was falling hard outside, but inside Nathaniel Harmon's cabin, the fire had burned down to embers hours ago. His neighbor Owen Driscoll stood in the center of the curved stone room, his hand pressed against the wall, feeling warmth radiating from the stones that had no right to be hot when the flames were nearly dead. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if forgotten frontier wisdom like this moves you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about survival itself. The winter of 1837 came to the Utah Territory with a cruelty that seemed almost deliberate. Nathaniel Harmon stood in his log cabin, feeding another piece of split pine into the fireplace, watching the flames climb hungrily up the stone chimney. The heat lasted only minutes before vanishing into the cold air that pressed against every wall. Outside, wind howled through the canyon and found every gap in the chinked logs, every crack in the mud daubing, every weakness in the corner joints where four walls met at right angles. Margaret lay in the bed he had built against the east wall, covered with every blanket they owned. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale visible in the lamplight as a small cloud of condensation. Pneumonia had taken hold 3 days earlier, and despite Nathaniel's constant fire tending, despite burning wood faster than he had ever imagined possible, the cabin stayed cold. Not freezing, but cold enough that recovery became impossible. The infant Clara slept against her mother's chest, wrapped in wool and deerskin. The baby's breathing matched Margaret's, thin, difficult, weakening. Nathaniel had built this cabin the previous spring using methods passed down from his father in Pennsylvania. 4 walls of notched logs, mud and moss, packed between the gaps, a stone fireplace and chimney, a solid door, 1 window covered with oiled paper. It was a good cabin by frontier standards, better than most. He had taken care with the construction, selected straight trees, fitted the logs carefully, but now he understood that careful was not the same as adequate. The fire roared in the hearth, consuming wood he had spent months cutting and splitting. The heat radiated outward, struck the walls, and simply disappeared. He could feel cold air pooling in the corners, especially the corner where Margaret's bed sat. The eastern wall, the northern wall, both seemed to conduct cold from outside directly through the logs. He had chinked those gaps twice, packed the moss tight, sealed it with clay. It made no difference. The chimney drew perfectly, which meant the smoke went up and out efficiently. But Nathaniel was beginning to realize that smoke was not the only thing escaping. The heat followed it, pulled upward and away by the same draft that kept the cabin from filling with smoke. He fed the fire again. The flames jumped. The warmth touched his face. For a moment, then was gone. Margaret's breathing changed in the night. Nathaniel heard it from where he sat by the fire, a subtle shift from labored to simply weak. He moved to her side, touched her forehead, still fevered, but her skin felt cold at the same time, as if the fever were fighting a losing battle against the temperature of the room itself. Clara stirred but did not wake. The baby's lips had a faint blue tint that terrified him. He went back to the fire and added more wood. The pile beside the hearth was diminishing rapidly. He had burned through more wood in the past 3 days than he normally used in 2 weeks. Outside, his winter supply was shrinking at an unsustainable rate. But that did not matter now. He would burn everything he had if it would save them. It would not save them. Some part of him knew this, had known it since yesterday when Margaret stopped being able to sit up on her own. The cold was winning, not because the fire was inadequate, but because the cabin itself was failing at its most fundamental purpose, to hold warmth inside and keep cold outside. Spring came to the Utah Territory in 1838 with wildflowers and melting snow, but Nathaniel Harmon barely noticed. He buried Margaret and Clara on the hillside overlooking his homestead, marking their graves with stones he carried up from the river. He built a simple fence around the plot to keep animals away, and then he returned to the cabin that had failed them. For 2 weeks he did nothing. He sat by the cold fireplace and stared at the wall where Margaret's bed had been. He ate sparingly from his stores. He did not check his trap lines or tend to the garden plot he had cleared the previous year. Neighbors stopped by occasionally. Owen Driscoll brought venison, Jacob Brennan offered help with spring planting, but Nathaniel sent them away with quiet thanks and no conversation. But his mind would not stop working. Even in grief, even in the paralyzed isolation of loss, questions formed and demanded answers. Why had the cabin failed? He had built it well. He had used sound techniques. Other settlers survived winters in identical structures. What had been different? What had he missed? He began studying the cabin with methodical attention. He examined the corner where Margaret's bed had sat and felt the cold air that still pooled there even on warming spring days. He traced the gaps between logs where chinking had compressed and cracked over the winter. He stood outside and observed how wind struck the flat walls and found every imperfection, every weakness, exploiting them with patient persistence. The corners troubled him most. 4 walls meeting at right angles created points where cold from 2 directions converged. The notched logs at corners looked strong, but Nathaniel could see how they had settled and shifted, opening tiny gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently seal. The weight of the roof pressed down on those notches, compressing them, creating movement that broke whatever seal he tried to create. He studied the fireplace and chimney. The stonework was solid, the draft was excellent, but he realized now that excellence in draft meant excellence in heat removal. Every bit of warmth that went up that chimney was warmth stolen from the room. The fire had to burn constantly, consuming enormous amounts of wood just to maintain barely adequate temperature. He started spending time outside, away from the cabin, walking the property and surrounding landscape. He found himself drawn to the river, to a spot where water had carved a curved channel through rock over countless years. He noticed how stones along the riverbank retained the sun's warmth well into evening, staying hot to the touch long after sunset. He observed how the curved canyon walls near his property created sheltered areas where wind seemed to lose its strength. One afternoon he placed his hand on a large river stone that had been in full sun all day. The surface was almost too hot to touch. He waited until evening and checked again, still warm. He checked after dark. Warmth remained, radiating from the stone into the cool night air. The stone was holding heat, releasing it slowly, acting as a reservoir that the sun had filled and that the night could not quickly empty. Something in Nathaniel's mind shifted. A possibility formed, unclear but insistent. Late spring brought longer days and warmer weather to the Utah Territory, and Nathaniel began spending those days at the river. He told himself he was checking trap lines, maintaining the equipment he had neglected through winter and early spring. But the traps remained unchecked. Instead, he studied stones. The river had smoothed them over years of tumbling and grinding, wearing away sharp edges until each stone was rounded and pleasant to hold. Nathaniel observed how different stones responded to sunlight. Dark stones absorbed heat quickly and held it longest. Light-colored stones stayed cooler. Large stones retained warmth for hours. Small stones cooled rapidly once the sun moved. He watched how water flowed around obstacles. Straight channels created turbulent, chaotic flow. Curved sections produced smooth eddies and calm pools. The principle seemed universal. Curves deflected force, while straight lines resisted it. Deflection required less energy than resistance. The river taught this lesson constantly to anyone willing to observe. Owen Driscoll found him there one afternoon, crouched beside the water, tapping stones with a small hammer. "You checking for gold?" Owen asked, attempting lightness with a man who had lost everything. "Checking for cracks," Nathaniel replied, holding a rounded stone up to the light. Stones with internal fractures sound different when struck. They won't hold weight properly. Owen watched him work for a moment. "What are you building, Nathaniel?" "I don't know yet." It was an honest answer. The idea was still forming, still unclear. He knew it involved stones and curves and heat retention, but the final shape remained undefined. Owen left him there, and Nathaniel heard the concern in his neighbor's voice when he said goodbye. The community was beginning to talk. The trapper who sat by the river tapping stones, the man whose grief had turned strange. Jacob Brennan stopped by the following week and found Nathaniel sorting stones by size, arranging them in groups along the riverbank. "This how you're spending your days now?" Jacob's tone carried judgment poorly disguised as concern. "I'm learning," Nathaniel said simply. "Learning what?" "How things hold together. How heat moves. How shapes affect strength." He picked up a stone from his sorted collection. "This stone will stay warm for 6 hours after the sun sets. A piece of wood the same size cools in less than 2. Why?" Jacob had no answer and left shaking his head. Nathaniel continued his work. He began gathering stones in earnest, loading them into a makeshift sled and dragging them back to his homestead. He selected only rounded stones with no visible cracks or flaking. He tested each one by striking it and listening to the tone. Solid stones rang clear. Fractured stones produced dull thuds. He rejected more stones than he kept. His collection grew slowly through late spring. Piles of sorted stones appeared near his cabin, large ones for foundations, medium ones for walls, small ones for filling gaps. Neighbors passing by saw the growing stockpiles and wondered what madness grief had produced. Nathaniel offered no explanations. He simply continued gathering, sorting, and planning something he could not yet articulate, but somehow knew would work. Summer arrived in 1838, and Nathaniel began construction. He chose a spot 50 yards from his old cabin on slightly higher ground with better drainage and clear sight lines. Using a long rope tied to a central stake, he marked a circle on the ground 22 feet in diameter. No corners, no straight walls, just a continuous curve that would loop back on itself. Owen Driscoll arrived with Jacob Brennan on the second day of work, drawn by curiosity about what Nathaniel was finally building. They found him digging a shallow trench along the circular mark, removing soil to create a level foundation bed. "Where are the corner posts going?" Owen asked, studying the curved trench with confusion. "There won't be corners," Nathaniel replied, not looking up from his work. Jacob laughed, thinking it was a joke. When Nathaniel did not join the laughter, Jacob's smile faded. "You can't build a cabin round. How will you frame walls? Where will the roof sit?" "The walls will support themselves. The roof will rest on top." Nathaniel began placing his largest river stones in the trench, testing their position, adjusting until each one sat stable and level. Owen watched him work for several minutes. "Nathaniel, that's not how cabins are built. You need 4 walls with proper corners. You need logs, not stones. What you're doing won't work." "It will work," Nathaniel said quietly. He positioned another stone, checking its alignment with the curve, ensuring it leaned slightly inward rather than sitting perfectly vertical. Word spread quickly through the scattered frontier community. The man who had lost his family was building something strange. Settlers came to observe, standing at a distance, watching Nathaniel lay stone after stone in a circular pattern that made no sense to anyone who understood construction. Daniel Fletcher, a mason who had worked in Philadelphia before heading west, made a special trip to see what was happening. Fletcher watched Nathaniel work for an hour before speaking. "You're dry stacking. No mortar?" "No mortar," Nathaniel confirmed. "That won't hold. Dry stack only works for short garden walls, maybe waist high. You're building something taller. Those stones will shift and collapse." Nathaniel set another stone carefully into position. Each stone holds the others through weight and friction. The curve creates compression. The inward lean locks them together. Fletcher shook his head. "I've been a mason for 15 years. What you're describing violates basic principles. Stone structures need binding. Rivers move stones for centuries, and they lock together fine without mortar. Rivers don't build walls." Nathaniel continued working. Fletcher left, and within days, the entire community knew that Nathaniel Harmon was attempting something impossible. He was building a round stone wall with no mortar, no corner bracing, no proper foundation. By the end of the first week, when the wall had risen only 3 feet, and other settlers had built entire log cabins in the same time, the mockery began in earnest. They called it Harmon's Folly. They called it the Stone Beehive. Owen Driscoll started joking that Nathaniel was building a monument to his dead family, not a dwelling for the living. The joke spread, became entertainment turned cruel through repetition. Nathaniel ignored them all and continued laying stones. Midsummer heat baked the Utah Territory, and the curved stone wall rose steadily. By early July, it had reached shoulder height. Nathaniel worked dawn to dusk, positioning each stone with careful deliberation. He rejected stones that did not fit the curve properly. He tested each placement by pushing hard, checking for movement, ensuring the stone was locked in position by the weight and friction of surrounding stones. Daniel Fletcher returned with 3 other settlers, determined to demonstrate the foolishness of Nathaniel's approach. Fletcher brought his tools and a bag of lime mortar. "Let me help you do this properly," he offered, his tone suggesting charity toward a man whose grief had impaired his judgment. Nathaniel straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I appreciate the offer, but mortar will weaken it, not strengthen it." Fletcher's expression hardened. "Mortar is what holds stone together. It's been used for thousands of years. Romans built aqueducts with mortar that still stand today." "Mortar is rigid," Nathaniel explained patiently. "When stone expands in heat or contracts in cold, rigid mortar cracks. Cracks let water in. Water freezes and widens the cracks. In 10 years, mortared walls need repair. These stones can shift slightly, accommodate changes, and stay locked together. That's not how engineering works. It's how rivers work, how canyons work, how nature builds things that last." Nathaniel returned to positioning his next stone. Fletcher and his companions left, convinced they had witnessed delusion. The story spread with embellishment. Nathaniel Harmon thought he knew better than trained masons. He believed rivers taught construction principles. His mind had broken along with his heart. The wall continued rising. As it grew taller, the curve tightened, each course of stones leaning slightly more inward than the one below. The structure was beginning to look less like a wall and more like an enormous basket being woven from stone. By August, it stood 6 feet high. The inward lean had become obvious, creating a shape that seemed to defy gravity. William Cross brought his 2 sons to watch one afternoon. "Looks like a giant's cooking pot," the older boy observed. "It looks unstable," Cross said, addressing Nathaniel directly. "How is that not going to fall inward on itself?" Nathaniel tapped the wall with his knuckles. "Same reason an arch stands. Compression. Every stone is being pressed against every other stone. The curve distributes weight evenly. There's no single weak point for failure." Cross studied the structure skeptically. "And when winter comes, when snow loads the roof, the weight will make it stronger, more compression, tighter lock." Owen Driscoll had begun running a joke through the settlement. He would ask newcomers if they had seen Harmon's Folly yet, then take them to observe. "Man's preparing his own tomb," Owen would say, loud enough for Nathaniel to hear. "Building himself a stone grave to die in come winter. Grief, it does strange things to a mind." The joke always got laughs. Nathaniel heard it multiple times, but never responded. He simply continued his work, laying stone after stone, building something no one believed would stand, for purposes no one understood except himself. Late August brought the wall to completion, 8 feet high, curving inward continuously until the opening at the top measured only 12 feet across. Nathaniel began constructing the roof framework using trimmed pine logs laid across the opening in a spoke pattern, meeting at a central point. Over these, he placed planks hewn flat on one side, overlapping them to shed water. The roof sat directly on top of the stone walls, but Nathaniel left deliberate gaps between the top stones and the roof's edge, spaces 6 inches wide running continuously around the entire circumference. Samuel Pritchard arrived as Nathaniel was finishing the roof work. Pritchard was older than most settlers, in his 50s, and carried the quiet authority of experience. He walked slowly around the structure, examining it from all angles before speaking. "No chimney," Pritchard observed. "No chimney," Nathaniel confirmed. "How do you vent smoke?" Nathaniel pointed to the gaps between wall and roof. "Smoke rises." "It'll find its way out through there?" Pritchard frowned. "You'll fill the cabin with smoke. You'll suffocate or go blind from the irritation." "Smoke rises naturally. With openings all around the top, it'll have plenty of escape routes. No single chimney pulling hard draft, just gentle venting in all directions." "That's not how it works," Pritchard said, though his tone was less certain than Fletcher's had been. "You need a proper chimney to create draw, otherwise smoke just pools at the ceiling." William Cross had joined them, listening to the conversation. "You'll smoke yourself to death by Christmas," he warned. "Mark my words, Nathaniel, this whole thing is madness, but trying to live in it without a proper chimney is suicide." Nathaniel said nothing. He had learned that explanations convinced no one. He cut a doorway in the stone wall using careful chisel work, installed a simple wooden door, and created a single small window on the south-facing side. The window was barely large enough to provide light, covered with oiled paper stretched across a wooden frame. Inside, the cabin was bare earth floor. Nathaniel dug a shallow depression in the center, lined it with flat stones, and created a fire pit with no grate or formal structure. To anyone who looked inside, it appeared primitive beyond comprehension, a stone cave with dirt floor and a hole for burning wood. No furniture yet, no shelves, no cabin amenities of any kind. The mockery reached its peak. Jacob Brennan brought travelers by to show them the stone beehive where Harmon plans to smoke himself like a ham. Owen Driscoll stopped making jokes and started expressing genuine concern. "You can't live in that," he told Nathaniel directly. "It's not safe. It's not sound. Winter will prove me right, and I'll find your frozen body in there come spring." Samuel Pritchard said nothing more, but privately he worried that Owen might be correct. The structure looked like something built for symbolic purposes, not practical habitation. A monument to loss, a place for Nathaniel to retreat from a world that had taken everything from him. By September, Nathaniel moved his few possessions into the stone cabin and began his preparations for winter. December of 1838 arrived with temperatures that shattered records settlers could remember. Snow fell for 5 straight days, accumulating to depths that buried fences and trapped livestock. When the snow stopped, the cold intensified. Water froze solid in covered wells. Livestock died in their pens despite shelters. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Frontier cabins became desperate fortresses against the temperature. Families burned wood at rates that depleted their winter supplies with alarming speed. The standard approach was simple: feed the fire constantly, keep flames roaring, burn everything available. Owen Driscoll's family went through 2 cords of wood in the first 3 weeks of December. William Cross burned through his carefully calculated winter supply by mid-January and began dismantling his spare shed for fuel. Settlers crowded their families into single rooms, abandoning the rest of their cabins to conserve heat. Children slept in coats and blankets near fires. Adults took turns through the night feeding flames that could not be allowed to die. Despite these efforts, cold seeped through walls, pooled in corners, found every gap and weakness. Frostbite became common. 2 children in the scattered community developed pneumonia. Nathaniel's stone cabin showed a single thin stream of smoke rising from the roof gaps. Neighbors passing by on desperate firewood gathering expeditions noticed something odd. The smoke was minimal, barely visible, nothing like the heavy plumes rising from every other chimney in the territory. More strangely, snow on the ground near Nathaniel's cabin was melting, not dramatically, but noticeably. A ring of bare ground surrounded the structure where snow had turned to water and drained away. Owen Driscoll stopped one afternoon, his curiosity overcoming his exhaustion from constant wood hauling. He approached the stone wall and placed his bare hand against it. The exterior stones were warm, not hot, but distinctly warm to the touch, despite outside temperatures well below freezing. Heat was radiating outward through the wall itself. Owen knocked on the wooden door. Nathaniel opened it, and warm air rolled out into the freezing afternoon. Inside, Owen could see a small fire burning in the central pit, not a roaring blaze, just a modest fire with flames barely a foot high. Yet the interior felt comfortably warm, warmer than Owen's own cabin, despite his massive fireplace consuming wood constantly. "How?" Owen asked simply. Nathaniel gestured to the curved stone walls. "The stones absorb heat all day. They release it slowly all night. The curve reflects warmth back toward the center. No corners where cold can pool. No chimney pulling heat up and out." Owen stood in the doorway, feeling the temperature difference between inside and outside. His cabin required constant attention, endless wood, exhausting labor just to maintain barely adequate warmth. Nathaniel's cabin seemed to heat itself with minimal effort. "I was wrong," Owen said quietly. "We all were." Jacob Brennan came by 2 days later, then Samuel Pritchard. Each man felt the warm stones, saw the small fire, experienced the comfortable interior. Word spread through the community, not as gossip now, but as urgent practical information. Harmon had built something that actually worked, something that solved the problem killing them all. February brought William Cross to Nathaniel's door in desperation. His family had burned through their entire winter wood supply, with 6 weeks of brutal cold still remaining. His 2 children were showing early signs of illness, the same shallow breathing, the same lethargy that preceded pneumonia. His wife had stopped getting out of bed to conserve energy and warmth. "I need help," Cross said simply, pride abandoned. "Can my family stay here while I gather more wood?" Nathaniel opened the door wider. "Bring them now." The Cross family moved in that afternoon. William, his wife Sarah, and their 2 sons aged 7 and 9. They brought blankets and what little food they had left. Sarah expected to find conditions worse than their own cabin, some kind of primitive shelter they would endure out of necessity. Instead, she found warmth that seemed impossible given the small fire burning in the center pit. The boys recovered within 3 days. Color returned to their faces. Their breathing normalized. Sarah regained her strength and began helping Nathaniel with daily tasks. William spent his days gathering firewood, but even working alone, he collected enough to keep Nathaniel's cabin warm with wood to spare. The efficiency was remarkable. On the 4th evening, after the children had fallen asleep on bedrolls near the wall, William asked the question that had been forming. "How does this work?" Nathaniel added a single piece of wood to the fire. "The stones absorb heat slowly during the day. A small fire in the morning warms the mass. By afternoon, the stones themselves are radiating heat inward. At night, when the fire dies to embers, the stones keep releasing warmth for hours. By morning, enough heat remains that a new fire quickly brings everything back to comfortable temperature." "But chimneys are supposed to draw smoke out," William said. "Everyone knows you need a good draft." "Chimneys draw smoke out efficiently," Nathaniel agreed. "But they also draw heat out. Every bit of warmth that goes up a chimney is warmth stolen from the room. My smoke vents slowly through the gaps at the roof, no strong draft pulling heat away. The warmth stays in the stones." Sarah touched the wall beside where she sat. The stone was warm, almost hot. "And the curve?" "No corners means no places for cold air to pool and settle. The curve reflects heat back toward the center, instead of letting it escape into corners. And the shape itself," Nathaniel traced the arc of the wall with his hand. "The stones lean inward. They lock together under their own weight. The curve distributes force evenly. It's strong because of its shape, not despite it." William sat quietly, processing information that contradicted everything he had believed about construction. "I mocked you," he said finally. "We all did." "You didn't know," Nathaniel replied. "I didn't know either until I started. paying attention to how rivers moved stones and canyons held warmth. The Cross family stayed 2 weeks while William stockpiled wood and made repairs to their own cabin. When they left, William asked if Nathaniel would teach him the technique. Nathaniel agreed without hesitation. Spring of 1839 brought Samuel Pritchard to the river with a small sledge. Nathaniel found him there one afternoon tapping stones with a hammer, testing for internal cracks. Pritchard looked up when Nathaniel approached, embarrassment crossing his weathered face. "Thought I'd try building one," Pritchard said simply. "My wife nearly froze last winter. Can't go through that again." Nathaniel spent the afternoon teaching Pritchard what to look for. Rounded stones without flaking clear tone when struck. Sufficient size for thermal mass. He explained the importance of the curve, the inward lean, the compression that created strength. Pritchard listened with the focused attention of a man whose survival depended on understanding. By autumn of 1839, 2 curved stone cabins were under construction within 15 miles of Nathaniel's homestead. Pritchard's rose slowly on a hillside overlooking his wheat field. William Cross had begun gathering stones, planning to build the following spring. Jacob Brennan, who had mocked the loudest, quietly asked Nathaniel for advice about foundation preparation. The technique spread organically through the scattered settlement network. Trappers passing through saw the structures and carried descriptions to other territories. Travelers stopped to examine the unusual round cabins and asked questions about construction methods. By 1841, curved stone cabins were appearing in Wyoming territory. By 1843, variations existed throughout the mountain settlements. The designs evolved as different builders adapted the core principles to their situations and materials. Some used mortar, despite Nathaniel's explanation that it was unnecessary. The mortar did not harm the structure, just added unnecessary work. Some built partial curves rather than complete circles, creating half-round cabins with one flat back wall of logs. Some integrated the curved stone wall into existing log structures, replacing the coldest wall with thermal mass. But certain principles remained consistent across all variations. Curved walls without sharp corners, stone construction for thermal mass, minimal or no chimney to prevent heat loss, patient, careful building that prioritized function over speed. The settlers who adopted these methods never called them by Nathaniel's name. They called them round wall cabins, arc houses, stone curves. The terminology varied by region and builder. Nathaniel shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, but he never promoted the technique or claimed credit for innovation. When builders came with questions, he answered them. When they asked him to examine their construction and offer advice, he did so. But he made no effort to spread the method beyond those who sought him out. He had not built his cabin to revolutionize frontier architecture. He had built it to survive after watching his family die from cold in a cabin that leaked heat faster than fire could produce it. The fact that others benefited from what he had learned through grief and observation was acceptable, even satisfying, but it was not his purpose. By 1845, Daniel Fletcher, the mason who had insisted Nathaniel's approach violated basic principles, had built his own curved stone cabin. He never acknowledged being wrong, but the structure spoke for itself. Physics and necessity had proven more convincing than any argument. Nathaniel Harmon died in 1867 at the age of 59. He passed quietly in his sleep on a cold March night, his curved stone cabin keeping him warm to the end. Neighbors found him 2 days later when he failed to appear at the settlement's weekly gathering. Samuel Pritchard and William Cross carried his body to the hillside where Margaret and Clara had been buried 3 decades earlier, and they laid him to rest beside his family. The territorial newspaper printed a brief obituary mentioning his homestead and years of settlement, but made no reference to the innovation that had changed how people survived mountain winters. To the wider world, he was simply another frontier settler who had lived, worked, and died in obscurity. His headstone, carved by Daniel Fletcher, bore only his name and dates. No mention of curved walls or thermal mass or grief transformed into methodical discovery. But throughout Utah, Wyoming, and Montana territories, dozens of curved stone cabins stood as functional monuments to what Nathaniel had learned. Some were still occupied by the original builders. Samuel Pritchard lived in his until 1873, William Cross until 1881. Others housed new families who recognized superior construction without knowing its origin. Travelers sought them out as way stations, knowing the round stone structures offered better shelter than standard cabins. The innovation persisted because it solved fundamental problems that every frontier settler faced: heat retention through brutal winters, structural stability that lasted decades without major repairs, resource efficiency that reduced wood consumption by half or more. These advantages needed no promotion or explanation. They were self-evident to anyone who spent a winter in a curved stone cabin versus a traditional log structure. New variations continued appearing into the 1870s and 80s. Miners in Colorado built half-round stone shelters against cliff faces. Ranchers in Montana constructed large, curved stone barns that protected livestock better than wooden structures. The principle that curves and thermal mass created superior shelter spread beyond residential cabins into broader frontier. Architecture. Nathaniel had never claimed credit, never sought recognition, never promoted his discovery as revolutionary. He had simply built something that worked, born from loss and observation, refined through patient experimentation. His motivation had been survival, not innovation. The fact that his survival technique became valuable to others was consequence, not goal. The curved stone cabin he had built in 1838 still stood in 1890, occupied by a family of 4 who had moved west after the Transcontinental Railroad made migration easier. They knew nothing of Nathaniel Harmon, or Margaret, or Clara, or the winter that had killed them. They simply knew their stone cabin stayed warmer with less work than their neighbors' wooden houses. His legacy was not carved in monuments or written in history books. It was built into walls that curved and held warmth, scattered across the frontier, standing as silent testament to what necessity and careful thought could accomplish when grief transformed into methodical innovation. The stones remembered what words never recorded, radiating warmth into cold nights, proving that the best solutions often come from those who simply refuse to accept that traditional methods were the only methods available.